It was a cold, misty morning in London. The grand, century-old mansion of Emma Whitmore stood silent amidst the thick fog, its towering presence hidden behind ornate iron gates. Inside, the opulence of her wealth was evident. Marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and antique furniture filled every corner. But the grandeur did little to warm the coldness that had settled into Emma's life. Hello. Welcome. Enjoy, subscribe, and activate notifications. At 82 years old, Emma was one of the wealthiest women in England, her fortune built on a vast empire of investments and real estate. Yet, despite her immense wealth, Emma led a life devoid of joy. Her days were spent in the company of her staff, none of whom dared to disturb her unless summoned, and the memories that haunted the grand halls of her mansion, the laughter of her late husband, the warmth of her sister's embrace, and the innocence of her own youth were now mere echoes in her mind, reminders of the love she had lost and the loneliness that had consumed her. But there was one part of her week that Emma looked forward to with a flicker of anticipation: her visits to St. Catherine's Orphanage. It was a modest establishment on the outskirts of the city, one that Emma had supported for decades with generous donations. Every Thursday, she would don her finest coat, the same one she wore for years, and instruct her driver to take her to the orphanage. For an hour each week, Emma would sit among the children, reading stories, listening to their chatter, and for a brief moment, she felt the weight of her loneliness lift. It was during these visits that Emma felt a connection to the world, a sense of purpose that her wealth could never provide. But lately, her attention had been drawn to a particular boy at the orphanage: Jacob. Jacob was 14, tall for his age, with unruly dark hair and piercing green eyes. There was something about him, something that stirred a long-buried memory in Emma. His eyes, his mannerisms. Everything about him reminded her of her younger sister, Caroline, whom she had lost touch with many years ago. Caroline had left for America with a man Emma disapproved of, and the sisters had never reconciled. As the weeks passed, Emma found herself drawn to Jacob more and more. She observed him closely, searching for any sign that might confirm the impossible thought forming in her mind. Was it possible that this boy, with his familiar features and distant demeanor, could be connected to Caroline? She had to know more. After one of her visits, Emma approached the headmistress, a kind but no-nonsense woman named Mrs. Henderson. "Mrs. Henderson," Emma began, her voice betraying the nervousness she felt, "I've taken a special interest in one of your children, Jacob. Could you tell me more about him? His background, his family?" Mrs. Henderson hesitated, sensing the unusual request behind Emma's normally composed demeanor. "Jacob came to us when he was just a baby," she explained. "He was left at the orphanage with no identifying information. We don't know much about his family, except that he was found with a note mentioning his mother's name, Caroline." Emma's heart skipped a beat. Could it be? Could this boy be the son of her estranged sister? The possibility both thrilled and terrified her. She needed to find out the truth. But how? She thanked Mrs. Henderson and left the orphanage that day with her mind racing. If Jacob was indeed her sister's son, it meant she had family, real, living family, right here in London. But how could she be sure? And if it were true, what would she do next? The thought of bringing Jacob into her life, of breaking free from her solitude, filled her with both hope and fear. As Emma's car wound its way back to the mansion through the fog-covered streets, she knew that her life was about to change forever. She was determined to uncover the truth, no matter what it took. Little did she know, this journey would lead her to a revelation far beyond what she could imagine. The days following Emma's visit to St. Catherine's Orphanage were filled with restless anticipation. She could not escape the thought that Jacob might be her nephew. The idea consumed her every waking moment, and even in her dreams, she saw visions of her sister, Caroline, holding a baby with Jacob's piercing green eyes. Emma knew she had to take the next step, but she was cautious by nature, aware that one wrong move could shatter the fragile hope she clung to. She needed answers, and she needed them discreetly. Early one morning, Emma summoned her trusted solicitor, Mr. William Hargrove, to the mansion. Mr. Hargrove had served the Whitmore family for decades, managing their vast estate with the utmost discretion. He was a man of few words, with a meticulous attention to detail, qualities Emma valued highly. "Thank you for coming on such short notice, William," Emma said as they settled in the study, a room lined with dusty books and dark wood paneling. "Of course, Mrs. Whitmore," he replied, his tone formal and respectful. "How may I assist you?" Emma hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "There is a matter of some delicacy that I wish to investigate. It concerns a boy at the St. Catherine's orphanage, a boy named Jacob. I have reason to believe he may be related to me, possibly the son of my sister, Caroline." Mr. Hargrove's eyes widened slightly in surprise, but he quickly regained his composure. "I see. And you wish to confirm whether this boy is indeed your nephew?" "Yes," Emma replied, her voice firm, "but I want to proceed with the utmost discretion. If he is my nephew, I must be certain before I take any further steps." "Understood," Mr. Hargrove said, nodding. "I will begin by locating any records related to your sister's time in America. We may be able to trace her movements and possibly find out if she had a child. I can also discreetly investigate Jacob's background to see if there is any connection." "Thank you, William," Emma said, feeling a wave of relief wash over her. "I don't know what I would do without your guidance." "Rest assured, Mrs. Whitmore, I will handle this matter with the utmost care," he assured her. With that, Mr. Hargrove left to begin his inquiries, leaving Emma alone with her thoughts. She felt a mixture of hope and dread. If Jacob was truly her nephew, it would mean she had found a piece of her lost family, a chance to mend the broken ties of the past. But if he wasn't, Emma couldn't bear to think of that possibility. Days turned into weeks as Emma waited for news. Each Thursday, she continued her visits to the orphanage, spending more time with Jacob. She watched him from a distance at first, noting how he interacted with the other children, always a bit apart, as if he felt he didn't quite belong. There was a quiet sadness in his eyes that tugged at Emma's heart. During one visit, Emma finally gathered the courage to speak to Jacob directly. She found him sitting alone under a tree in the orphanage's garden, a book in his lap. Approaching slowly, she took a seat on the bench beside him. "What are you reading, Jacob?" she asked gently. Jacob looked up, surprised to see her. "It's a book about explorers," he said, his voice soft and guarded. "I like reading about their adventures, the places they go, the things they discover." "Explorers are brave," Emma remarked, trying to draw him out. "They venture into the unknown, facing dangers and challenges, but they always find something extraordinary." Jacob nodded, his gaze distant. "I guess I just like the idea of discovering something new, maybe something that changes everything." Emma felt a pang in her chest. She could see the longing in Jacob's eyes, the same longing she had felt for years, searching for something to fill the void in her life. "Jacob," she began cautiously, "have you ever wondered about your family? Where you come from?" Jacob stiffened slightly, his expression wary. "I've thought about it, but no one really knows. I was just left here." Emma's heart ached for the boy. She wanted so badly to tell him what she suspected, but she knew it wasn't the right time. Instead, she reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're not alone, Jacob. Sometimes, family is closer than you think." Jacob looked at her, searching her eyes as if trying to understand the deeper meaning behind her words. After a moment, he simply nodded, though it was clear he was still guarded. As Emma left the orphanage that day, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was on the brink of a life-changing discovery. The connection she felt with Jacob was undeniable, but until Mr. Hargrove returned with concrete evidence, all she could do was wait. And then, one evening, as the first snowflakes of winter began to fall, Mr. Hargrove arrived at the mansion with an envelope in hand. His expression was grave as he entered the drawing room where Emma was waiting by the fire. "Mrs. Whitmore," he began, handing her the envelope, "I have found the information you were looking for." Emma's hands trembled as she took the envelope. Inside was a birth certificate, yellowed with age, bearing the name of the child, Jacob, and there, listed as his mother, was Caroline Whitmore. Emma gasped, tears welling in her eyes. It was true, Jacob was her nephew. The boy she had grown so fond of was the son of the sister she had lost so many years ago. The revelation hit her like a wave, washing over her with a mixture of joy, sorrow, and overwhelming relief. She had found him. She had found a piece of her family, of herself. But as the initial wave of emotion subsided, a new thought crept into her mind. What now? How would she tell Jacob? How would she bring him into her life, into her home? Would he even want to leave the orphanage, the only home he had ever known? Emma knew that this was only the beginning. The journey ahead would be filled with challenges. But for the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of hope, a reason to keep going. The revelation of Jacob's true identity left Emma Whitmore in a whirlwind of emotions. The confirmation that Jacob was indeed her nephew, the son of her estranged sister, Caroline, was both a blessing and a burden. As she sat in her drawing room, staring at the birth certificate Mr. Hargrove had handed her, Emma's mind raced with the possibilities and the challenges that lay ahead. After a long night of restless thoughts, Emma made a decision. She couldn't keep this discovery to herself any longer. Jacob deserved to know the truth about his heritage, about the family he never knew he had. But the thought of how to approach him, how to reveal something so monumental, filled her with anxiety. She knew Jacob had grown up in the orphanage, surrounded by the familiar faces of the staff and other children, and she feared how he would react to such life-altering news. The following Thursday, Emma arrived at St. Catherine's Orphanage with a renewed sense of purpose, though her heart pounded in her chest. She had decided to speak with Mrs. Henderson first, to ensure that the headmistress was aware of the situation before she spoke to Jacob. Mrs. Henderson greeted Emma warmly, as always, though she could tell something was different today. Emma seemed more determined, more focused. As they settled into Mrs. Henderson's modest office, Emma wasted no time. "Mrs. Henderson," Emma began, her voice steady but soft, "I have some important information regarding Jacob, the boy I've taken a particular interest in." Mrs. Henderson's expression shifted to one of concern. "Is something wrong, Mrs. Whitmore? Has something happened?" "No, nothing is wrong," Emma assured her. "But I have discovered something about Jacob's past, something significant. He is my nephew, Mrs. Henderson. He is the son of my sister, Caroline." The headmistress's eyes widened in surprise, and she leaned back in her chair, taking a moment to absorb the news. "Your nephew? This is quite extraordinary. But how did you come to this conclusion?" Emma explained everything: her suspicions, the investigation carried out by Mr. Hargrove, and the discovery of the birth certificate. Mrs. Henderson listened intently, nodding as Emma spoke, but she also seemed cautious. "This is a remarkable discovery, Mrs. Whitmore," Mrs. Henderson said after a pause. "But you must understand, Jacob is a sensitive boy. He has never known anything about his family. This will be a lot for him to take in." "I understand that," Emma replied, her tone filled with sincerity. "But I believe he has a right to know. I want to give him a chance to have a real family, to live in a home where he is loved and cared for." Mrs. Henderson nodded slowly. "You've always been so kind to the children here, and I can see that you genuinely care about Jacob. If you believe this is what's best for him, then I will support you in telling him. But we must do it carefully, with compassion." Emma agreed, feeling a mixture of relief and nervousness. Together, they devised a plan to break the news to Jacob gently. They decided that Mrs. Henderson would speak to Jacob first, explaining that there was someone who cared deeply about him and wanted to talk to him about something important. Then Emma would join them and she would reveal the truth. That afternoon, Mrs. Henderson called Jacob into her office. The boy walked in, his usual quiet demeanor intact, though Emma could sense a hint of curiosity in his eyes as he glanced around the room. Mrs. Henderson motioned for him to sit, and he did so, folding his hands in his lap. "Jacob," Mrs. Henderson began gently, "I wanted to talk to you about something very special today. You know Mrs. Whitmore, don't you?" Jacob nodded. "Yes, ma'am. She visits every week." "That's right," Mrs. Henderson continued. "Mrs. Whitmore has been very fond of you, Jacob. She sees something in you, something that reminds her of someone very dear to her. Jacob looked puzzled, his brow furrowing slightly. What do you mean? At that moment, the door opened, and Emma stepped into the room. Jacob turned to see her, his confusion deepening. Mrs. Henderson gave him a reassuring smile. Jacob, Emma said softly as she approached, I have something important to tell you, something about where you come from. Jacob's eyes widened with a mix of fear and hope. He had always wondered about his past, about the parents he never knew. Now, it seemed those answers were finally within reach. Jacob, Emma continued, her voice trembling slightly, I believe you are my nephew. Your mother, Caroline. She was my sister. The room fell silent, the weight of Emma's words hanging in the air. Jacob stared at her, his mind struggling to process what he had just heard. For a long moment he said nothing, his thoughts racing. My mother? He finally whispered, as if testing the word. Yes, Emma replied, her voice full of emotion. Your mother was my sister. I lost touch with her many years ago, but when I saw you, I felt. Jacob's eyes filled with tears, but he didn't look away from Emma. So, you're my family? Yes, Jacob, Emma said, her own eyes glistening with tears. You have family. You have me. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, as if the realization finally hit him, Jacob stood up and walked slowly toward Emma. She opened her arms, and without hesitation, Jacob fell into them, his small body shaking as he cried into her shoulder. Emma held him tightly, her heart breaking and healing all at once. You're not alone anymore, Jacob, she whispered. You have a home with me if you want it. You can come and live with me, and we can be a family. Jacob pulled back slightly, looking up at her with tear-streaked cheeks. I want that, he said, his voice choked with emotion. I want to be with you. Emma smiled, her heart swelling with a love she hadn't felt in years. Then it's settled, she said softly. We'll be together, and we'll start a new life. Just you and me. As they embraced once more, Mrs. Henderson quietly wiped away her own tears, grateful that Jacob had found the family he so desperately needed. The path ahead would not be easy, but at that moment as Emma and Jacob held each other, they both knew they had found something precious, something that money could never buy. The days that followed were a whirlwind of preparations and emotions for both Emma and Jacob. After their heartfelt reunion, Emma moved swiftly to make her home ready for Jacob's arrival. Her grand mansion, once filled with an unbearable silence, now buzzed with activity as rooms were prepared, and plans were made to integrate Jacob into her life. Emma's staff, though initially taken aback by the sudden change, quickly adapted to the new situation. They had always respected Emma, but now they saw a new side of her, one filled with warmth and purpose. Mrs. Whitmore had a glow about her that had been absent for years, and it was clear that Jacob had brought something back into her life that had long been missing. On the day Jacob was to leave the orphanage and move into the mansion, Emma arrived at St. Catherine's Orphanage with a sense of nervous excitement. She had brought along her most trusted maid, Mary, who would help Jacob settle in. As they stepped out of the car and walked toward the entrance, Emma's heart raced. This was a monumental day, one that would change both their lives forever. Inside, Jacob was waiting, his belongings packed in a small, worn suitcase. He looked up as Emma entered, his face a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. The past few days had been overwhelming for him. Learning that he had family, that he would be leaving the orphanage and moving into a mansion, that his life was about to change in ways he had never imagined. But beneath the fear was a growing excitement. He was finally going to have a home, a real family. Are you ready, Jacob? Emma asked gently, seeing the emotions flicker across his face. Jacob nodded, though he couldn't quite find his voice. He looked around the orphanage one last time, taking in the familiar sights. It had been his home for as long as he could remember, and though he was eager to leave, there was a part of him that felt a pang of sadness. Mrs. Henderson approached them, her eyes moist with emotion. Jacob, she said softly, kneeling down to be at his level, I'm so happy for you. You deserve this more than anyone. Remember, You'll always have a place here if you ever need it. Thank you, Mrs. Henderson, Jacob whispered, his voice trembling. He stepped forward and hugged her tightly, and she held him for a long moment before letting go. With the goodbyes said, Jacob took Emma's hand, and together they walked out of the orphanage. As they drove through the streets of London, Jacob stared out the window, his eyes wide with wonder. The city looked different today, more vibrant, more alive, as if reflecting the changes in his own life. When they arrived at the mansion, Jacob's awe only grew. The towering structure, with its grand entrance and sprawling gardens, seemed like something out of a fairy tale. Emma watched him carefully as they stepped inside, hoping that he would feel welcome in his new home. "This is your home now, Jacob," Emma said softly, watching his reaction. "You can go anywhere, do anything you like. I want you to feel comfortable here." Jacob nodded, though he was too overwhelmed to say much. Mary, the maid, stepped forward with a warm smile. "Let me show you to your room, Master Jacob. We've prepared it just for you." Jacob followed Mary up the grand staircase, his small hand gripping the banister as he took in the opulence around him. They reached a large door, which Mary opened to reveal a spacious bedroom, decorated in soft blues and whites. There was a large bed with a thick comforter, a bookshelf filled with new books, and a window that overlooked the gardens. Jacob stood in the doorway, his breath catching in his throat. This room was bigger than the entire dormitory at the orphanage. It felt unreal, like a dream he might wake up from at any moment. "Do you like it?" Emma asked, her voice tinged with nervousness. It's amazing," Jacob finally said, stepping inside and running his hand along the smooth wood of the bed frame. "I've never had a room like this before." Emma smiled, relief washing over her. "I'm glad you like it. This is your space, Jacob. You can make it your own." As Jacob explored his new room, Emma felt a warmth in her heart that she hadn't experienced in years. She had always been surrounded by luxury, but it had never meant anything to her. Now, seeing Jacob's joy, she realized that this was what she had been missing. A connection, a purpose, someone to share her life with. The first few days were a period of adjustment for both of them. Jacob was shy and reserved at first, unsure of how to navigate this new world of wealth and privilege. He had spent his life in an orphanage, where resources were scarce, and he was used to fending for himself. Now, he was surrounded by servants who catered to his every need, a luxurious home where he had everything he could ever want, and a great aunt who doted on him. Emma was patient, giving Jacob space to acclimate. She understood that he needed time to adjust, and she didn't want to overwhelm him. She made sure to spend time with him every day, whether it was during meals, exploring the gardens, or simply sitting together in the drawing room. One evening, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Emma noticed Jacob was unusually quiet. He was staring into the flames, lost in thought. "Is something on your mind, Jacob?" she asked gently. Jacob hesitated before speaking. "It's just, everything here is so different. I keep thinking about the orphanage, about the other kids. It feels strange to be here, in a place like this, when I know they're still there." Emma nodded, understanding his feelings. "It's normal to feel that way, Jacob. You've been through a lot of changes in a short time. But I want you to know that it's okay to be happy here, to enjoy your new life. The other children at the orphanage will be taken care of, just as you were." Jacob looked at her, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "I know. It's just, I never thought I'd have something like this. It doesn't feel real." Emma reached over and took his hand, squeezing it gently. "It is real, Jacob. You deserve this and so much more. And I'm here to help you every step of the way." Jacob managed a smile. She knew it would take time for him to fully embrace his new life, but she was determined to be there for him, to give him the love and security he had been missing for so long. As the days turned into weeks, Emma and Jacob began to settle into a routine. They took meals together, explored the vast library, and spent hours in the garden, where Jacob discovered a love for plants and nature. Emma found herself growing more attached to him each day, her heart swelling with pride as she watched him open up, little by little. But despite the growing bond between them, There was still a lingering fear in Emma's heart, a fear that something or someone might disrupt the fragile happiness they had found. She knew that the process of adopting Jacob, of making him her own legally, would not be without challenges. There were formalities to go through, questions to answer, and potential obstacles to overcome. And then there was the question of Jacob's father. Emma knew very little about him, only that he and Caroline had parted ways before Jacob was born. She feared that if he were to discover Jacob's existence, he might try to claim him, to take him away from the life they were building together. These worries kept Emma awake at night, but she knew she had to stay strong, for Jacob's sake, and for her own. They had come too far to let fear hold them back now. Together, they would face whatever challenges lay ahead, and they would do it as a family. Weeks turned into months, and Jacob gradually settled into his new life at Emma's mansion. The once lonely halls now echoed with the sound of his footsteps, his laughter, and the lively conversations he shared with Emma. Their bond grew stronger with each passing day, and for the first time in years, Emma felt a deep sense of fulfillment and joy. She had found a purpose in caring for Jacob, and in return, he had brought light into her life that she hadn't known she was missing. But beneath the surface of their newfound happiness, Emma couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. The process of officially adopting Jacob was progressing smoothly, thanks to Mr. Hargrove's diligent efforts. But there was one unresolved matter that kept her on edge: the identity of Jacob's father. Emma knew little about the man who had been involved with her sister Caroline. Caroline had been secretive about her relationship, and when she had left for America, she had cut off almost all contact with her family. Now, the fear that Jacob's father might reappear and claim his son gnawed at Emma's peace of mind. She had to know more: who he was, where he might be, and what kind of man he had become. One afternoon, Emma summoned Mr. Hargrove to the mansion. They sat together in the study, the warm glow of the fireplace casting flickering shadows on the walls. "William," Emma began, her tone serious, "I need your help with something that has been weighing on my mind. We've made good progress with Jacob's adoption, but there's still a matter we haven't addressed: his father." Mr. Hargrove nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Yes, I've been considering that as well, Mrs. Whitmore. We don't have much information about him, but it's important to be thorough. If he were to contest the adoption or attempt to claim custody, it could complicate things." "Exactly," Emma replied. "I need to know who he is and where he might be. We can't afford to be caught off guard." "I can begin an investigation," Mr. Hargrove suggested. "It might take some time, but I'll do everything I can to locate him and gather any relevant information." "Please do," Emma said, her voice firm. "I don't want any surprises. Jacob has been through enough already. He deserves stability, and I won't let anyone take that away from him." Mr. Hargrove nodded in agreement. "I'll start immediately and keep you informed of any developments." As Mr. Hargrove left to begin his inquiries, Emma felt a mix of relief and anxiety. She was taking steps to protect Jacob, but the uncertainty of what they might discover loomed large in her mind. Over the next few weeks, life at the mansion continued as usual, though Emma found herself growing increasingly distracted. She watched Jacob closely, her heart swelling with pride at how well he had adapted to his new life. He was thriving, his once reserved nature giving way to a more confident and curious boy. He had even started attending a nearby private school, where he quickly excelled in his studies and made new friends. One evening, as they sat together in the drawing room after dinner, Jacob brought up a subject that caught Emma off guard. "Aunt Emma?" Jacob began hesitantly. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course, Jacob," Emma replied, giving him her full attention. "Do you know anything about my father?" Jacob asked, his voice cautious. "I mean, I know my mother was your sister, but I don't know anything about him. Sometimes I wonder who he was, where he is now." Emma felt her heart tighten. She had hoped to avoid this conversation until she had more information, but she knew she couldn't keep Jacob in the dark forever. "I don't know much, Jacob," she said carefully. "Your mother didn't talk about him very often. From what I understand, they were together for a time, but their relationship ended before you were born. He wasn't a part of your life, and I'm not sure where he is now." Jacob nodded, his expression thoughtful. I wonder what kind of man he was, if he ever thought about me. Emma reached out and took Jacob's hand, squeezing it gently. I understand, Jacob. It's natural to have questions, to want to know more about where you come from. But I want you to know that no matter what we find out, you have a family here with me. You're not alone. Jacob smiled, though Emma could see the uncertainty in his eyes. Thanks, Aunt Emma. I'm glad I have you. As the days passed, Emma waited anxiously for news from Mr. Hargrove. She threw herself into her daily routines, trying to keep her mind occupied. But the looming question of Jacob's father was always there, just beneath the surface. Finally, one afternoon, Mr. Hargrove arrived at the mansion with a thick folder in hand. Emma could tell from the look on his face that he had uncovered something significant. Mrs. Whitmore, Mr. Hargrove said as they sat down in the study, I found some information regarding Jacob's father. His name is Michael Davies. He and Caroline were involved for a few years before they separated. After the breakup, he seemed to disappear from Caroline's life. It appears he never knew about Jacob. Emma felt a rush of relief. So he doesn't know Jacob exists? Correct, Mr. Hargrove confirmed. But there's more. Michael Davies has a criminal record. Nothing too serious, mostly minor offenses, but enough to suggest he's had a troubled life. He's been moving from place to place, never staying in one location for too long. It's unlikely he's looking to settle down or reclaim a child he never knew about. Emma absorbed this information, her mind racing. So he's not a threat to Jacob? Not at the moment, Mr. Hargrove replied. But we should still proceed with caution. If he were to find out about Jacob, he might attempt to make contact, whether out of curiosity or some other motive. We'll need to be prepared for that possibility. Emma nodded, her determination solidifying. We'll protect Jacob, whatever it takes. With the information in hand, Emma felt a sense of resolve. She knew the path ahead might still hold challenges, but she was prepared to face them. Jacob's father was out there, somewhere, but he was not a part of their lives, and Emma was determined to keep it that way. As she watched Jacob grow and flourish in his new life, Emma knew she had found her true purpose. The loneliness that had once consumed her had been replaced by love, by a bond that she would protect at all costs. And though the future was uncertain, Emma was ready to face it, as long as Jacob was by her side. Winter had settled over London, casting the city in a blanket of snow. The mansion, now lively with the sounds of Jacob's presence, had taken on a warmth that had been absent for many years. Emma found herself cherishing the simple moments, reading by the fire, watching Jacob explore the gardens even in the cold, and sharing stories about her past. She had come to think of Jacob as the son she never had, and the thought of losing him, now that she had found him, was unbearable. Despite the relative calm, Emma couldn't completely shake the unease brought on by Mr. Hargrove's investigation. Knowing that Jacob's father, Michael Davies, was out there, albeit unaware of Jacob's existence, left her on edge. But as the weeks passed without incident, she allowed herself to relax slightly, focusing instead on the upcoming Christmas season, a time she hoped would cement the bond she had forged with Jacob. The mansion was transformed with decorations. The halls were adorned with garlands, wreaths hung from the doors, and a grand Christmas tree stood in the foyer, its branches heavy with ornaments collected over the decades. Jacob had never experienced a Christmas like this. At the orphanage, the holidays had been modest, with few gifts and little fanfare. But here, he was swept up in the magic of the season, and for the first time he felt the true joy of being part of a family. As Christmas Eve approached, Emma planned a special celebration for the two of them. She wanted to make it a night Jacob would remember, a night that would solidify their new life together. They spent the day baking cookies, decorating the tree, and wrapping presents. Emma couldn't remember the last time she had felt so alive, so connected to another person. That evening, after a festive dinner, they sat together by the fire, the warm glow casting a soft light over the room. Jacob was unusually quiet, and Emma could sense that something was on his mind. Is everything all right, Jacob? She asked gently, setting down her cup of tea. Jacob hesitated before answering, his eyes fixed on the flickering flames. "I've been thinking about what you said. About my father." Emma's heart skipped a beat. She had hoped they could enjoy the holiday without that shadow hanging over them, but she knew she couldn't avoid the subject forever. "What about him, Jacob? I've been wondering. What if he does find out about me?" Jacob said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What if he wants to see me? Or take me away?" Emma felt a wave of protectiveness wash over her. She had worked so hard to create a safe and loving environment for Jacob, and the thought of losing him to a man who had never cared for him was unbearable. "Jacob," she said, her voice firm but tender, "I want you to know that I will do everything in my power to protect you. Your father. He's not a part of our lives, and as long as you're with me, I will make sure he doesn't interfere." Jacob looked up at her, his eyes full of uncertainty. "But what if he does come? What if he wants me back?" Emma's heart ached at the fear she saw in Jacob's eyes. She reached out and took his hand, holding it tightly. "Listen to me, Jacob. You are my family now. I love you, and I won't let anyone take you away from me. We've been through so much to get here, and I won't let anything ruin what we have." Jacob nodded, but Emma could see that he was still troubled. She wished she could offer him more reassurance, but the truth was that she shared his fears. If Michael Davies ever discovered Jacob's existence, it could complicate everything. The next morning, Christmas Day dawned cold and bright. Emma and Jacob spent the morning opening presents by the tree, and for a while, the worries of the previous night were forgotten. They laughed, played, and enjoyed each other's company, the spirit of the holiday wrapping them in a cocoon of warmth and love. But that evening, as they sat down to dinner, the phone rang. Emma excused herself and answered it in the hallway, her heart sinking as she recognized Mr. Hargrove's voice on the other end. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, his tone unusually serious. "I'm afraid I have some news. Michael Davies has been asking questions. He's been trying to track down Caroline's family, your family. I think it's only a matter of time before he finds out about Jacob." Emma's breath caught in her throat. "Are you sure, William? How did he find out?" "It seems he's been doing some digging, asking around about Caroline. I don't have all the details yet, but it's clear he's looking for something, or someone." Emma's mind raced. The peaceful life she had built with Jacob suddenly seemed fragile, on the verge of being shattered by a man she had never even met. "What do we do?" "We need to be prepared," Mr. Hargrove advised. "I'll take steps to make sure we have legal protections in place, but you should be ready for the possibility that he might show up." Emma thanked him and hung up, her heart pounding in her chest. She stood there for a moment, trying to steady her breathing, before returning to the dining room where Jacob was waiting. He looked up as she entered, a slight frown on his face. "Who was that?" Emma forced a smile, trying to keep her voice steady. "Just Mr. Hargrove. He wanted to wish us a Merry Christmas." Jacob seemed to accept the explanation, and they continued their meal, but Emma's mind was elsewhere. The joy of the holiday was overshadowed by the fear that their happiness might be threatened. She knew she couldn't keep this from Jacob for long, but she also didn't want to ruin his Christmas. She would wait at least for a few days before telling him the truth. As the days passed, Emma found herself on edge, constantly looking over her shoulder, waiting for the other shoe to drop. She was determined to protect Jacob, no matter what it took, but the uncertainty gnawed at her. Every time the phone rang or there was a knock at the door, her heart would leap into her throat, fearing that it might be Michael Davies. Then, one evening in early January, her fears were realized. It was a cold, windy night, and Emma and Jacob were in the library, reading by the fire. The doorbell rang, echoing through the mansion, and Emma felt her stomach clench. She exchanged a glance with Jacob, who seemed oblivious to her growing anxiety. "I'll get it," she said, trying to keep her voice calm. She made her way to the front door, her heart pounding in her chest. As she opened it, a gust of cold wind blew in, and there, standing on the doorstep, was a man she had never seen before. He was tall, with dark hair and a weathered face, his eyes sharp and searching. "Mrs. Whitmore?" the man asked, his voice rough. Emma nodded, her hand gripping the doorknob tightly. Yes. Who are you? The man's eyes flickered with recognition. My name is Michael Davies. I believe we have something important to discuss. Emma felt the blood drain from her face. He had found them. Emma stood frozen in the doorway, the frigid January wind whipping around her as she stared at the man before her. Michael Davies. The name she had hoped never to hear, the man she had feared would come for Jacob, was now standing on her doorstep. His eyes, dark and intense, seemed to bore into her, searching for something. An answer, perhaps, or a weakness. She knew she had to remain calm, composed. She couldn't let him see how much his presence unsettled her. Gathering her strength, she forced herself to speak. Mr. Davies, Emma said, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. What brings you here? Michael took a step closer, his gaze unwavering. I think you know why I'm here, Mrs. Whitmore. I'm looking for my son. The words hit her like a blow, even though she had anticipated them. Her mind raced as she tried to decide how to respond. She knew she couldn't deny Jacob's existence. Michael had clearly done his homework, but she also couldn't allow this man to disrupt the life she had built with Jacob. Your son, Emma repeated, carefully choosing her words. Jacob has been living with me for several months now. He's happy here, Mr. Davies. He's found a home, a family. Michael's expression hardened, and Emma could see the determination in his eyes. I never knew about him, Mrs. Whitmore. Caroline kept him from me. But he's my blood, and I have a right to know him, to be a part of his life. Emma felt a surge of anger rise within her. And where were you all these years? When Jacob was growing up without a father, without a family. You can't just walk back into his life and expect everything to be fine. Michael's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Emma thought she saw a flicker of regret in his eyes. But it was quickly replaced by a steely resolve. I've made mistakes, I admit that. But I'm here now, and I'm not leaving without seeing my son. Emma's heart pounded in her chest. She knew this confrontation was inevitable, but she hadn't expected it to happen so soon, or so abruptly. She needed time to think, to plan, to protect Jacob. Jacob is inside, she said finally, her voice firm. But this is not the time or place for this conversation. If you truly care about him, you'll let me explain things to him first. Give him time to understand. You can't just show up and expect him to accept you. Michael hesitated, his gaze softening slightly. I just want to see him, Mrs. Whitmore. I want him to know that I'm here, that I care. Emma considered his words carefully. She knew she couldn't keep Michael away from Jacob forever, but she also couldn't allow this meeting to happen without preparing Jacob first. The boy had been through so much already. He deserved to be protected from any more sudden shocks. I'll speak to him, Emma said finally. But you need to give us some time. Come back tomorrow afternoon, and we'll talk. Michael seemed to weigh her words, then nodded reluctantly. All right, tomorrow afternoon. With that, he turned and walked back down the steps, disappearing into the night. Emma closed the door, her hands trembling as she leaned against it, trying to steady herself. She had managed to buy some time, but tomorrow would bring a new challenge, one she wasn't sure how to face. Emma took a deep breath and returned to the library, where Jacob was still reading, oblivious to the storm brewing outside. She watched him for a moment, her heart heavy with the knowledge of what she had to tell him. She had promised to protect him, to give him a stable life, and now she had to confront the reality that those promises might be shattered. Jacob, she said softly, her voice trembling despite her efforts to keep it steady. Jacob looked up, sensing the seriousness in her tone. What is it, Aunt Emma? What's wrong? Emma sat down beside him, taking his hand in hers. There's something I need to tell you, something important. But I want you to know that whatever happens, I'm here for you. You're not alone. Jacob's eyes widened with concern. What is it? Emma took a deep breath. Your father, Michael Davies, he's here, Jacob. He came looking for you. Jacob's face went pale, and his hand tightened around Emma's. My father? He's here. Yes. Emma replied gently. He found out about you and he wants to see you. He says he wants to be a part of your life. Jacob's eyes filled with fear and confusion. But I don't even know him. Why does he want to see me now? Emma's heart broke at the pain in Jacob's voice. She wished she could take it all away, make everything simple and safe for him, but she knew she couldn't shield him from this. I don't have all the answers, Jacob, she said softly. But what I do know is that you don't have to make any decisions right now. You can take your time, and whatever you choose, I'll support you. You're not alone in this. Jacob stared at her, tears welling in his eyes. I don't want to go with him, Aunt Emma. I don't want to leave you. Emma pulled him into a tight embrace, her own tears threatening to spill over. You don't have to do anything you're not ready for, Jacob. Promise, we'll figure this out together. They sat there for a long time, holding each other as the fire crackled in the hearth. Emma's mind was racing, trying to come up with a plan, a way to protect Jacob from the man who had suddenly reappeared in his life. She knew she couldn't keep Michael away forever, but she also couldn't let him disrupt the stability and happiness they had found. As the night wore on, Emma made a decision. Tomorrow, when Michael returned, she would make it clear that Jacob's well-being came first. She would fight for him, for the life they had built together, and she would not let anyone take him away. But as the clock ticked down to the meeting, Emma couldn't shake the nagging fear that Michael might not be so easily deterred. He had come this far, he wasn't likely to back down now. And as much as she wanted to protect Jacob from the truth, she knew that eventually he would have to face his father. The next day dawned cold and gray, the sky heavy with the promise of snow. Emma could barely eat breakfast, her stomach twisted with anxiety. She knew that by the afternoon, everything could change. When the time came, Emma and Jacob waited together in the drawing room, the tension between them palpable. Jacob was quiet, his hands clenched in his lap as he stared at the clock on the mantel. Emma sat beside him, trying to project calmness, though her heart was pounding. Finally, the doorbell rang, the sound cutting through the silence like a knife. Jacob flinched, and Emma placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. I'm right here with you, she whispered. You're not alone. They both stood as Mary, the maid, showed Michael into the room. He entered slowly, his eyes immediately finding Jacob. There was a moment of silence, heavy with unspoken emotions, as father and son looked at each other for the first time. Jacob, Michael said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. I'm your father. Jacob stared at him, his expression unreadable. Why now? He asked, his voice trembling. Why are you here now, after all this time? Michael took a step closer, his eyes filled with regret. I didn't know about you, Jacob. If I had, things would have been different. But I'm here now because I want to be a part of your life. I know I've missed a lot, and I can't change that, but I want to make things right. Emma watched Jacob's reaction carefully, ready to intervene if needed. She could see the confusion, the fear, and the anger all. You were never there, Aunt Emma. She's the one who's taken care of me. Michael's gaze flickered to Emma, and she met his eyes with a steady, unwavering stare. I understand that, Jacob, he said gently, and I'm grateful to Mrs. Whitmore for everything she's done for you. But I'm still your father, and I want to get to know you. I want to be in your life. Jacob looked down at the floor, his shoulders slumping. I don't know what to do. Emma stepped forward, placing a protective arm around Jacob. You don't have to decide anything right now, Jacob. This is a lot to take in, and you have every right to take your time. Mr. Davies, she said, turning to Michael. Jacob's well-being is my top priority. If you truly care about him, you'll give him the space and time he needs. Michael nodded, though Emma could see the tension in his expression. I don't want to rush anything, Mrs. Whitmore, but I do want to spend time with him, to get to know him. Emma hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. We can arrange something, but it will be on Jacob's terms. He needs to feel safe and comfortable, and I won't let anything jeopardize that. Jacob looked up at her, his eyes filled with uncertainty. What if I don't want to see him? Emma's heart ached at the pain in his voice. Then you don't have to, Jacob. You're in control here. Whatever you decide, I'll support you. Michael watched them, his expression unreadable. I'll respect your wishes, Jacob, but please just give me a chance. Let me show you that I care. Jacob didn't respond, his gaze dropping back to the floor. Emma could see the turmoil in him, and she wished she could take it all away, but she knew that this was something Jacob had to work through on his own. I'll leave you to think about it, Michael said quietly, sensing the tension in the room. I don't want to force anything, but I'll be around if you want to talk. With that, he turned and left the room, the door closing softly behind him. Emma exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding and turned to Jacob. It's okay, Jacob, she said soothingly. You don't have to make any decisions right now. We'll take this one step at a time. Jacob nodded, but Emma could see the uncertainty in his eyes. She knew that this was only the beginning. The path ahead was fraught with challenges, but she was determined to face them with Jacob by her side. Whatever happened, they would face it together. The days following Michael Davies' visit were tense and uncertain. Emma could sense the turmoil brewing inside Jacob, though he tried to hide it. The boy who had once been full of life and curiosity now seemed withdrawn, lost in his own thoughts. It broke Emma's heart to see him like this, and she struggled to find the right words to comfort him. Michael kept his word and did not push for immediate contact. Instead, he sent letters to Jacob, short, carefully worded notes in which he tried to express his desire to know his son, to build a relationship. Each letter was delivered to the mansion, and each one sat unopened on Jacob's nightstand. He wasn't ready to read them yet, and Emma didn't push him. As winter gave way to spring, the tension in the mansion seemed to lessen slightly, though it never fully disappeared. Jacob began to spend more time outdoors, taking solace in the gardens that had become his sanctuary. Emma often found him sitting on the stone bench by the rose bushes, staring out at the flowers with a faraway look in his eyes. One afternoon, as they sat together in the garden, Emma decided it was time to have a conversation they had both been avoiding. Jacob, she began softly, watching him as he absent-mindedly traced patterns in the dirt with a stick. I know this has been difficult for you. I want you to know that whatever you're feeling, it's okay. You don't have to go through this alone. Jacob glanced up at her, his expression conflicted. I just don't know what to think, Aunt Emma. I've spent my whole life not knowing who my father was, and now that he's here, I'm scared. What if he doesn't really care about me? What if he just wants to take me away? Emma's heart ached for him. I understand your fears, Jacob. It's natural to be scared. But I want you to know that no matter what happens, I'll always be here for you. You have a home with me, and nothing will change that unless you want it to. Jacob's eyes filled with tears, and he looked down at the ground. I don't want to leave you, Aunt Emma. You're the only family I've ever known. Emma felt her own tears welling up, and she reached out to gently lift Jacob's chin so he could meet her gaze. And you're the family I've longed for, Jacob. You've brought so much joy into my life, and I can't imagine it without you. But you deserve to know the truth about your father, to make your own decisions about him. Whatever you choose, I'll support you. Jacob hesitated, his emotions warring within him. Finally, he nodded. I think I want to talk to him, but I'm not ready to see him yet. Maybe I could write him a letter. Emma smiled, relief flooding through her. That's a good idea, Jacob. You can take your time, say what you need to say, and you don't have to face him until you're ready. They returned to the mansion, and Emma helped Jacob settle at his desk, providing him with paper and a pen. She left him alone to write, sensing that he needed privacy to gather his thoughts. As she walked through the quiet halls, she couldn't help but feel a mixture of pride and sadness. Jacob was growing up, facing challenges that no child should have to, but he was handling it with a strength that she deeply admired. Jacob spent the next few hours writing and rewriting his letter, carefully choosing each word. When he was finally satisfied, he brought it to Emma, who read it with a mixture of pride and sorrow. The letter was simple, but it was filled with raw honesty. Jacob's fears, his uncertainties, and his hope that, if his father truly cared, they could start to build a relationship, slowly and on Jacob's terms. With Emma's encouragement, Jacob sent the letter. The waiting that followed was agonizing for both of them, but Emma did her best to keep Jacob's mind occupied. They took long walks through the gardens, explored the city, and spent evenings by the fire, reading stories and sharing quiet moments of comfort. A week later, a response arrived. The envelope was plain, the handwriting unfamiliar, but as soon as Jacob saw it, he knew it was from his father. His hands trembled as he opened it, and Emma sat beside him, her heart pounding in her chest. The letter was surprisingly heartfelt. Michael acknowledged Jacob's fears, his right to feel uncertain, and his desire to take things slowly. He expressed his deep regret for not being a part of Jacob's life sooner, but assured him that he was committed to being there now, in whatever capacity Jacob was comfortable with. He didn't push for a meeting, but instead offered to continue writing letters, allowing them to get to know each other from a distance until Jacob felt ready. Emma watched as Jacob read the letter, his expression shifting from fear to tentative hope. When he finished, he looked up at her, his eyes wide. "What do you think, Aunt Emma?" he asked, his voice wavering. Emma smiled gently. "I think it's a good start, Jacob. He's respecting your wishes, and that's important. It's up to you now to decide how you want to move forward." Jacob nodded slowly, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. I think I want to keep writing to him, just to see how it goes." Emma felt a surge of pride in Jacob's maturity. "That sounds like a wise choice, Jacob. You're in control here, and you can take as much time as you need." And so, a new routine began. Jacob and Michael exchanged letters regularly, each one a little more open and personal than the last. Slowly, Jacob began to ask questions about his father's life, his past, and the reasons he had stayed away for so long. Michael, to his credit, answered with honesty, admitting his mistakes and expressing his desire to make amends. As the weeks passed, Emma saw a change in Jacob. The fear and uncertainty that had weighed him down began to lift, replaced by a cautious optimism. He still spent his days at the mansion, attending school and enjoying his life with Emma, but now there was something new in his life, a connection to his past that he had never had before. One afternoon, as they sat together in the library, Jacob looked up from his latest letter from Michael and asked a question that took Emma by surprise. "Aunt Emma," he began slowly, "do you think it's okay for me to see him? I mean, I'm not sure I'm ready, but I also don't want to keep avoiding it forever." Emma considered his words carefully. She knew this was a pivotal moment for Jacob, a decision that would shape his future. "I think you should listen to your heart, Jacob. If you feel like you're ready, then it might be time to take that step. But there's no rush. You can go at your own pace." Jacob nodded, deep in thought. "I think maybe I am ready, but only if you come with me." Emma smiled, her heart swelling with love for the boy who had become her family. "Of course, Jacob. I'll be right by your side, every step of the way." They arranged the meeting for the following weekend. It would be a simple gathering, just the three of them, in a neutral place where Jacob could feel comfortable. The days leading up to the meeting were filled with a nervous energy, but there was also a sense of anticipation, a feeling that this was a necessary step in Jacob's journey. When the day finally arrived, Emma and Jacob drove to a quiet cafe on the outskirts of the city. It was a place with large windows, letting in the soft afternoon light, and a calm atmosphere that helped to ease their nerves. Michael was already there, seated at a corner table, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. Jacob hesitated at the entrance, and Emma gently squeezed his shoulder. "Whenever you're ready, Jacob. There's no rush." Jacob took a deep breath, then nodded. Together, they walked over to the table, and Michael stood up as they approached. There was a moment of awkward silence as father and son faced each other, unsure of what to say. "Hi, Jacob," Michael said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "Hi," Jacob replied, his voice barely above a whisper. Emma could see the tension in both of them, but she also saw the longing in their eyes, a desire to bridge the gap that had separated them for so long. She took a seat beside Jacob, offering silent support as the conversation began. The initial moments were hesitant, filled with nervous small talk, but gradually, they began to relax. Michael asked Jacob about his interests, his school, and the things he enjoyed doing. Jacob, in turn, asked Michael about his life, his work, and the places he had been. There were moments of awkwardness, but also moments of genuine connection, as they discovered shared interests and common ground. Emma watched them with a mixture of pride and sadness. She was proud of Jacob for facing his fears, for opening himself up to the possibility of a relationship with his father. But she also couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness at the thought that this new connection might change the bond she had with Jacob. She knew it was irrational. She had always wanted what was best for him, and this was a part of that. But the fear of losing him, even just a little, lingered in the back of her mind. As the afternoon wore on, the conversation became more comfortable, more natural. By the time they finished their drinks, there was a sense of ease between Jacob and Michael that hadn't been there at the start. "Thank you for meeting with me, Jacob," Michael said as they stood to leave. "It means more to me than I can say." Jacob smiled shyly. "I'm glad we did this. Maybe we can do it again sometime." Michael's face lit up with hope. "I'd like that. Whenever you're ready, I'll be here." As they left the cafe, Emma felt a sense of peace settle over her. The meeting had gone better than she could have hoped, and though the future was still uncertain, she felt more confident that Jacob would find his way through this. In the car on the way home, Jacob leaned his head against Emma's shoulder, the tension of the day finally slipping away. "Thank you, Aunt Emma," he whispered, "for everything." Emma kissed the top of his head, her heart full of love. "You're welcome, Jacob. I'm so proud of you." As they drove back to the mansion, Emma knew that their journey was far from over. There would be more challenges ahead, more difficult decisions to make, but she also knew that they would face them together, as a family. And in the end, that was all that mattered. The weeks that followed Jacob's first meeting with his father were a time of growth and reflection for both him and Emma. Their bond, though challenged by the introduction of Michael Davies into their lives, remained strong. Jacob's letters to his father continued, each one a little more open than the last, and they began meeting regularly, always with Emma nearby, offering her quiet support. Emma watched with a mixture of pride and trepidation as Jacob navigated this new chapter in his life. He was growing into a thoughtful, mature young man, balancing the complexities of his relationship with Michael while still maintaining the deep connection he shared with her. But as much as she celebrated Jacob's progress, she couldn't deny the lingering fear that he might eventually choose to live with his father, leaving her alone once more. One afternoon, as they sat together in the mansion's garden, Jacob turned to Emma with a question that had been on his mind for some time. "Aunt Emma," he began hesitantly, "do you think I should spend more time with my dad? He's been asking if I'd like to stay with him for a weekend." Emma's heart skipped a beat. She had known this moment would come, but it didn't make it any easier. She took a deep breath, reminding herself that Jacob's happiness and growth were her top priorities. "If that's something you want to do, Jacob, then I think you should," she replied carefully. "You've been doing so well, getting to know him. Spending more time with him might help you understand your relationship better. But remember, whatever you decide, you'll always have a home here with me." Jacob nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I know, Aunt Emma, and I'm not ready to leave you, not for good. But I think it might be good to see what it's like, just for a weekend, to see how it feels." Emma smiled, though her heart ached at the thought of even a brief separation. "I think that's very mature of you, Jacob. I'm proud of how you're handling all of this. And I'll be here, waiting for you, whenever you're ready to come home." They arranged for Jacob to spend the following weekend with Michael. As the day approached, Emma felt a growing sense of anxiety, but she kept it hidden, focusing instead on making sure Jacob felt confident in his decision. When the day finally came, Emma stood at the door of the mansion, watching as Jacob climbed into Michael's car. He gave her a small wave before they drove off, and Emma waved back, forcing a smile. The weekend without Jacob was one of the longest Emma had ever experienced. The mansion, once filled with the sounds of Jacob's laughter and footsteps, felt eerily quiet, a stark reminder of the solitude she had known before he entered her life. She tried to keep herself busy, reading, gardening, even catching up on correspondence, but nothing could fully distract her from the empty feeling that had settled in her chest. On Sunday evening, when Jacob finally returned, Emma's heart swelled with relief. She rushed to the door to greet him, trying to gauge his mood. He seemed tired but content, a small smile playing on his lips as he hugged her tightly. "How was it?" Emma asked, her voice filled with concern and curiosity. Jacob pulled back slightly, looking up at her. "It was different. Good, I think. Dad and I talked a lot, and he showed me some of the places he likes to go. It was nice, but it didn't feel like home." Emma felt a mixture of emotions: relief, pride, and a bittersweet understanding. "I'm glad you had a good time, Jacob, and I'm even more glad to have you back home." Jacob smiled, his eyes warm with affection. "This is home, Aunt Emma. It always will be." As the weeks turned into months, Jacob continued to grow closer to his father, but his bond with Emma remained as strong as ever. The arrangement they settled into, a balance of time spent with Michael and time at the mansion, seemed to work well for everyone. Jacob was thriving, surrounded by the love of both his father and his great-aunt, and Emma found peace in knowing that she had given him the stability and support he needed. Then, one summer afternoon, as Emma and Jacob were walking through the gardens, Jacob turned to her with a serious expression. "Aunt Emma, I've been thinking a lot about something," he began, his tone thoughtful. "About the future." Emma's heart skipped a beat. She had been dreading this conversation, fearing that Jacob might be ready to leave her for a new life with his father. But she steeled herself, determined to support whatever decision he made. "What is it, Jacob?" she asked gently. Jacob took a deep breath. "I've loved getting to know my dad, and I'm glad we have a relationship now. But I don't want to live with him. I want to stay here with you. This is where I belong. But I also want to ask, do you think we could invite Dad to be more a part of our lives? I think it would be nice if we could all spend time together." Emma felt a wave of relief wash over her, followed by a deep sense of pride. Jacob had found a way to honor both his relationships, embracing his father while still cherishing the life they had built together. "I think that's a wonderful idea, Jacob," Emma said, her voice filled with emotion. "We can make this work together. You've shown so much maturity and wisdom, and I'm so proud of you." Jacob smiled, his eyes shining with happiness. "Thank you, Aunt Emma. I couldn't have done any of this without you." And so, their lives continued to evolve, with Michael becoming a regular presence at the mansion. He and Emma, though different in many ways, found common ground in their shared love for Jacob. They began to plan outings together, Sunday dinners, and even holidays, creating new traditions that blended their lives into something that felt whole and complete. Emma's mansion, once a place of loneliness and sorrow, was now filled with laughter, love, and the vibrant energy of family. The fears that had once plagued her, of losing Jacob, of being alone, had been replaced by a deep sense of contentment. She had found her purpose, her family, and her happiness. Years later, as Emma sat by the fire, now older and with Jacob grown into a confident, compassionate young man, she reflected on the journey they had taken together. It had been filled with challenges, heartache, and uncertainty, but it had also brought her more joy than she had ever imagined. Jacob was no longer the frightened boy she had met at the orphanage. He was a young man ready to face the world, supported by the love of both his father and the great-aunt who had become his true family. And as she watched him, surrounded by the people who loved him, Emma knew that the legacy she had built was not in the wealth she had amassed or the mansion she had maintained, but in the lives she had touched, the love she had given, and the family she had created. She had found her peace, her purpose, and her home in the heart of the boy she had saved, and who had saved her in return.